Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today on Building a Security Program Part 2, Policies to Live or Die By. This is our second in our 5-part series on building a security program, so we're very excited about this webinar today. Before I turn it over to Paul, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the question box. We'll have time to answer questions at the end. If you are looking for a recorded version of the webinar, it will be sent to you by email after the webinar along with a copy of the slides, and it will also be available for download on our website. If you'd like to join our Twitter conversation, you can use the hashtag #SecurityPoliciesWebinar, and we will be live tweeting during the webinar as well. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks everybody for attending this morning. This is part 2 of our security program building webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about policies to live or die by. And a couple quick points about me. So I'm Paul. I'm one of the co-founders of TruShield. I'm also the Chief Security Architect. I've got about 17 years of experience in information security, probably a little more than that now. And if you have any questions with respect to either this webinar or cybersecurity in general, I'd invite you to please reach out to me either via email or on LinkedIn or Twitter. We're actually pretty active on LinkedIn and Twitter, so as Robin said, if you want to get involved in the social media conversation, please do follow us or, again, reach out to me directly. I'm always happy to have a conversation about this stuff. So the roadmap to cybersecurity includes a 5-step program, which is what we're driving towards with this webinar series. And what we're going to be talking about today is the part 2, the policies to live or die by. A couple of weeks ago, actually almost a month ago now, we started with the governance webinar, and we'll end up in June at the oversight and compliance phase. But today we're going to be talking about policies. And policies are a key part of a holistic cybersecurity program that starts with governance, as we talked about last time, and flows down into policy, which then contributes towards process controls, and that results in that oversight and compliance. Basically, at that point, we're going to be verifying whether or not we're compliant with the policies that we are talking about today. So it's a key part of it, and a lot of what we're going to do later in this series is really driven by what we define as the policy for a given security control. Much of the stuff that is in those security control descriptions and specific requirements for security controls is going to come directly from these policies, and the policies are also going to be driven by a few things as well. So in the grand scheme of things, you can see where policy fits, and again, it starts with governance, flows into policy, and then works its way down through control implementations. So today we are going to be talking about the what and why of policies. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between policies, standards, and guidelines, and there's some important differences there. We'll talk about some essential policies for your company. There are many, and there are some that you absolutely must have. There are some that are going to be applicable or relevant to you if you have a couple of things, and there are some that are probably not going to be relevant to you. But the vast majority of the stuff that we are going to talk about will be directly relevant and usable in your organization. We're going to give you some examples of some policies and point you to some resources that you can use to develop your own policies. And then we're going to talk to you a little bit about how managed security services partner like TruShield can help define and implement policy for you. So what are policies and why do you need them? Policies are the statements of requirements of how you go about doing business on a day-to-day basis. What's required of your organization to maintain a secure operating state, and not just secure but also compliant. And last time, if you were with us during the governance webinar, we talked about the difference between security and compliance and how it's important to view security as the goal and compliance to be a byproduct of a secure operating environment. And policy is a lot of where that really gets defined. Your regulations are really going to define your compliance requirements, and how you write that into your policy determines whether or not you're going to be simply compliant or actually secure. And the implementation of those policies via security controls that you're going to bake into your systems or write into requirements that your employees must live by is really the important part of bridging the gap between compliance and security. And that's an important concept to remember. Again, we harp on this. It's important that security is the goal and compliance is the outcome of operating in a secure environment. So bear in mind that. The policy statements are going to include a number of different components mostly centered around what are we requiring from either a given security control or what's the organization really required to do in a specific circumstance. Additionally, what happens when we aren't compliant or when we fail to achieve the goals of that policy, or when we're not in line with what we're required to do from the policy. The enforcement part of it's really important. The other thing that is really important to know about policies is that it's really easy to write a policy that is impractical and not really implementable in the real world. And I see that time and again where organizations write policy in kind of a vacuum and end up with a policy that's so cumbersome or so difficult to implement that employees seek ways to work around them, and that totally defeats the purpose. So policies really got to be written in a manner that's going to be practical, implementable, measurable, and something that you can live with, because it's really easy, again, to write policy that is not possible to live with, and at that point you might as well not have done it in the first place. And that's really where the policies to live or die comes from, because it's again very easy to write policy that is utterly useless for your organization, actually does more harm than good. So we want to try to avoid that wherever possible. And how we do that is by keeping focused on these key areas here. So information security policy, first off, I'd like to highlight the green bubble there. Focused on desired results. That's really the key. We want to be looking at where we're trying to go and what we're actually trying to achieve by writing a specific policy. Focused on things like ensuring passwords are complex and protected, or ensuring remote access is done in a secure manner. Things like that. Focus on the result, the outcome that you're trying to get out of the organization, or where you're trying to take the organization. It's also really important to identify roles and responsibilities, because there are certain aspects or certain employees or roles within your organization that will be responsible for implementing a policy, and some which are simply going to be at the mercy of the policy. And it's good to know, and not just good to know, but it's important to write into the policy who and what role they have with respect to either implementing or following the policy that's stated there. It's also extremely important that you state the actual required actions. So I'm going to take the password policy example again. So password policy might state something like you're required to have a complex password and need to change it regularly. And if you just say something like that, complex password and change regularly, that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And it's not really good to leave a whole lot of room for interpretation in a security policy. In fact, a lot of times what you'll find in the main security regulations, let's take FSMA or HIPAA or even PCI as an example, they do leave room for interpretation, and that interpretation is up to the organization to implement the specific required actions at the organization level. And a lot of times, again, FSMA or even ISO as an example, there are required controls in there that will simply state organization defined. And it's up to us at that point to define what actually is the requirement for our own organization. Really important that we do that in a manner that's tailored to our organization and not just simply in a vacuum because it sounds like a good thing to do. Because again, it's really easy to write policy that is totally impractical for the real world, and something which your employees will seek to work around. And I promise you they will find ways to work around it too, so make sure you keep that in mind. What that really leads us to is the disciplinary actions for failure to comply. And that's an extremely important part of policy. You have to have that enforcement aspect of it. Employees need to know that a policy has teeth and that failure to comply with it actually does have some consequence for them. If they don't recognize that, or if they feel like there really is no consequence, then they're not really going to be invested in ensuring that that policy is complied with. And again, are going to seek ways to do their jobs as easily as they can, and not necessarily with concern for security or compliance with policy. So important that that's recognized there. And you know, consequences or enforcement doesn't necessarily need to be termination or anything like that, but it could be additional training, or it could be you know, some more stringent monitoring of that particular employee's activities. But it's important that there is some sort of enforcement mechanism in place there. And that also is where tied back to that roles and responsibilities aspect of it too. You need to state in the rules of behavior that your employees are required to comply with policy, and you also need to state that they should expect to have consequence if they fail to comply. up to and including termination. And then the roles responsible for monitoring compliance of the policies need to be stated explicitly as well. Typically, a mid to large organization is going to have an oversight and compliance group, or perhaps even a single person that's responsible for oversight and compliance, and that's really where that role lives, is there with respect to enforcement. Being able to monitor and measure how well we're complying with policy is an important aspect of it. And nearly all of the main regulations require that you do that, that you report to the regulatory body how well you're complying with specific controls, usually control by control, and that's all going to link back to your policy. In the federal world, this will usually come via a SSP, or System Security Plan, where you document your individual control implementations and the policies that you're required to implement. And that stuff, again, is all linked back to the individual specific controls in the NIST documentation supporting FSMA. ISO is really similar in that regard, where there are very specific controls laid out, and your ISSP is going to link directly back to the requirements of the actual regulation. And the majority of the regulations out there are going to be very similar in that regard. And that's why it's really important to know that policy, standards, and guidelines all work together, and that the regulations are actually what are driving the policies, procedures, guidelines. At the end of the day, while we do say that security is the focus and compliance is the byproduct of it, the reality is that the regulations are going to be key drivers for how we implement our policy, how we write our procedures, of how we do our day-to-day operations and the work that we do in compliance with that regulation, and then the standards and guidelines that we're required to implement. And it probably sounds like policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines are all really similar things, and they are, but there are some key differences amongst all of those. And those key differences are this. So policy or procedure is really the document that specifies the requirements. It sets the stage for what is it that we have to do as an organization, and how do we go about doing it is left to either the standards or guidelines. It's usually, the policy statements are very specific. They're going to cover one single area, and if they're too broadly defined, they're going to be a lot of room for interpretation again, and not highly practical in terms of implementation. The standard is going to typically flow from a policy or procedure, and that standard is going to be a mandatory set of configurable items that have to be implemented by anybody that is under the auspices of that policy. So think of a standard as something like a configuration baseline requirement, where we must meet, for instance, the United States government configuration baseline mandatory compliance. There are other standards out there that are similar to that are mandatory, and you can look at it as a mandatory requirement. A guideline is a little fuzzier. It's not mandatory. It's usually a suggestion, typically called best practices. It's how something should be configured if it's meant to be secure. And the guidelines are typically not requirements, at least by regulation, but your policy may require that you implement best practices. And I do see that quite frequently with respect to things like configuration baseline policies, stating that systems must be configured in accordance with best practices. And what really is being said there is we're going to follow some configuration guideline for implementing a security control within our environment. Again, they're not truly requirements from a regulatory standpoint, but they're certainly strongly recommended. And the reason for that is because they were developed usually by a consortium of individuals that have decades plus of experience of implementing systems like this. And it's more effective to utilize those guidelines as a frame of reference than it is to build it yourself and kind of reinvent the wheel. A lot of times when people ask me about guidelines, I point to a couple of reference frameworks that I find really useful in my own work. The most useful of which, for me at least, is the SANS 20 Critical Security Controls, which serves as both a frame of reference for a best practice of how to set up your security environment, and also a really effective mechanism for measuring how mature your security organization is. Not truly a regulation, not really a policy or standard, but it is a very good guideline, very good best practice for implementing security in your environment, and that's the SANS 20 Critical Security Controls. And we'll actually talk a little bit about SANS more later. So this, what we're trying to show here is how the ecosystem looks with respect to these different things we're talking about. How do they work together? The one thing I'll state about this that you're looking at right now is that regulations kind of sit over and above all of this stuff. And it's all, regulations feeding into all of it. But we'll start with policy there. So policy, again, sets the stage, sets the direction. It has to be signed by some designated authority within the organization and put into force. Again, because without that authority to operate, the enforcement component of it's going to be missing or inadequate, and people won't follow the policy if there's no enforcement consequence. Policy is going to be, again, driving the standards and guidelines. It's going to be driving how we go about implementing the controls that we're calling out in the policy. And that relationship is important because the standard really shouldn't be guiding the policy. It should be the other way around. And the guideline, again, certainly shouldn't be driving policy because guidelines can change. Guidelines are kind of they're more technically focused on specific technologies or systems or controls, and security environments they change pretty rapidly. Technology changes pretty rapidly, so the policy should state again something like we're going to configure our systems in accordance with best practices, and those best practices may change over time as we learn new things about how to operate computing environments or how threats are trying to attack us, and so it's important to remember that. Standards and guidelines are usually implemented by procedures and processes, in fact. So, and it's an important component of an overall security program to write those procedures out, step-by-step instructions of how specific actions that will implement a policy. And that's the important part too. Compliance with the procedure is mandatory, even though a guideline might not necessarily be mandatory. If we're writing into policy that we're required to implement according to best practices, the implementation component of that written into procedure actually is mandatory. And that's something like when your systems administrators configure a new server, they're going to walk through a step-by-step set of instructions of how to do that, including things like asset tagging, including things like configuration of secure computing baseline, like the CIS security benchmarks, or again the USGCB, or even a DISA STIG. It's also going to include things like vulnerability scanning that device before it gets onto the network. Stuff like that, and those step-by-step procedures are designed to help us not let things slip through the cracks. And again, it's all going to be tied back to the policy requiring that we're doing these different things that are intended to secure the environment. At the end of the day, security is still the goal, but compliance is mandatory. The other component of this that's really important to view is that continuous improvement loop at the bottom there. We're going to learn things simply by operating, simply by doing business and walking through those procedures time and again. What worked, what didn't work. Maybe there was a security incident that occurred that we realized if we had an extra step in that procedure to account for some specific threat, we'd have avoided the risk in the first place. That's a lesson that should be learned and baked back into updates to the whole program. And not even just the policy. While the lessons learned does point to the policy update, that could also point back to standards or guidelines as well, because those can also be updated in response to changing events within the environment. But it's important to know that this ecosystem all works together, and like anything in technology, there's a life cycle aspect to it. If you simply do it once in kind of a set and forget mindset, it's going to be inadequate in the long term because your environment's going to change probably pretty rapidly, and if your policies are stagnant and not updated at least yearly, you're going to fall behind really quickly. So it's important to note that that continuous improvement loop should happen at least yearly. You don't want to be rewriting your policy all the time, but your guidelines and standards probably do need to be updated somewhat regularly. But I would recommend at least an annual update to your information security policies as a best practice or a guideline. So what are some essential policies that you actually need to be thinking about? There are many policies that contribute to a mature security program. We've grouped these into a couple different buckets here, and a lot of this comes from the SANS organization that has a lot of policies out on their website that are available for use. So I would recommend that if you are looking for guidance on how to create a policy that's tailored to you, you check out the SANS.org Security Resources Policy section. There actually is a link at the bottom of the screen there. Highly recommend you review that, and it gives you a lot of very good pointers, but still allows for that tailorability to your own environment. But the main buckets of policies that we're going to talk about today are just general policies that really apply to a large set of aspects of your organization. Your network security policies, we're going to talk about things like ports and protocols. Endpoint security policies, so stuff that would apply to a computing device, be that a server or a desktop or an iPhone, and then application security policies, so how you secure your applications. If you're using any custom web applications or even off-the-shelf stuff, how do you secure that stuff? So let's dive into general policies. So within general policies, again, there are many, and this is a subset. Ones that we feel are really important that you spend time on are acceptable use, what's appropriate for an individual to be doing within your environment. That's very closely tied to the rules of behavior. And if I had to pick two that were the most important, I would probably say it's those two. The rules of behavior really sets the stage for what's allowed within your organization. And if you recall back to last webinar where we talked about governance and really setting the tone for the corporate culture around security at the highest level of the organization, that's really the rules of behavior that we're talking about there. And that's where everybody needs to be under the context of that, including the senior leadership. And that's why it's super important that that governance aspect of it has that leadership buy-in because they also need to comply with the rules of behavior. And I know if there are any systems administrators out there in the audience today, you probably configured something at the request of a senior leadership member in direct contradiction to a policy. I'm sure that's happened to somebody in the audience. I know earlier in my career I was asked to do that a couple of times as well. So it's important that the senior leadership is bought into the policies and that they know that they're required to comply just as much as the line employees are. If they don't, then what's going to happen is that's going to foster an environment wherein people say, well, if they don't have to follow it, why do I? And again, they're going to look for ways to work around the policies. And that's not to anybody's benefit. A couple of other important ones to call out here are password policy, and we're actually going to drill into password policy a little bit later. Passwords obviously are one of the last bastions of security between the bad guys and your sensitive data. And if passwords are compromised, then essentially all hope is lost. Let's say it that way. So really important that your password policy is very well defined and meets the rigor of the data that you're trying to protect. Other ones that are very important, they're all really important, but incident response policy is extremely important because when a security incident does happen, and a security incident will happen, your organization needs to know how to act and what to do and who needs to be notified, and all that stuff needs to be baked into an IR policy. That IR policy also needs to reference the actual incident response plan where you talk through the actual steps that are taken during that incident response activity. Disaster recovery policy, also extremely important. And the one that I get asked about frequently is that use of employee-owned devices policy. You'll often hear that called bring your own device, or BYOD. And your organization needs to have something written into policy governing how you handle that. There are a lot of unique aspects to that specific policy that are important to call out. So a couple of examples, if an employee is using their own device on your network, do you have the right to monitor their activities above and beyond just their normal operating business? And in some cases the answer is yes, in some cases the answer maybe is no. It kind of depends upon what industry you work in and how you guys do business. Another one is, with respect to that one specifically, if an employee loses their personally owned device and that device is known to have business data on it, do you have the right to remotely wipe the hard drive of that machine if you have the technical capability to do so? Because in doing so, you probably are impacting that user's personal information as well. So I think it's appropriate to be able to do that, but the employee needs to be aware that that's a possibility, and that possibility has to be defined in this policy here. And the employee needs to understand that that's the case and typically needs to sign off on it. Oftentimes also baked into that rules of behavior document is an acceptance where the employee needs to sign off saying, I've read and reviewed this policy and I agree to comply with it. Really important that stuff is done because, again, without that, and certainly without that signature, the enforcement aspect of it is going to be much harder for you to actually implement. So really important, all this stuff. And again, if you have any specific questions about any one of these policies, I'd recommend you either reach out to us by email or take a look at that SANS resource that we mentioned earlier. So that's general policies. What about network security policies? There are, again, many, and this is a subset of the ones that we find to be particularly important. Network security is really talking about how data is transferred across your network, either into and out of your network or within it. And so all of this stuff is important to do securely. One of the ones that I typically point out as amongst the most important is that continuous monitoring policy. Because the organization needs to have the ability to monitor the network for inappropriate activity at the employee level or malicious activity from an attacker perspective at the network edge and also within the network itself. So very important that you write into your policy that we are going to be monitoring this particular type of traffic, and employees should not expect to have any right to privacy as they operate on our network. Important to have that capability. Also within the policy there, you're going to find things like log retention or log management, and we'll talk about those a little bit later as well when we talk about endpoint. But very important to have that written into it. Remote access policy, how are your employees accessing your network remotely? Are they doing it via VPN? If they are, is there two-factor authentication required? Is there a VPN client that needs to be installed, or are they going to use a virtual desktop instance or something like that? And are there specific actions that they're allowed to take remotely versus locally on the network? And all that stuff is usually baked into a remote access policy. One important thing that I usually see forgotten in remote access policies is administrative logins. With respect to security devices at the network edge, it's a best practice to not expose your firewall's login pages to the internet itself, but rather only expose those to internal IP addresses and require a VPN access for the employee that might be off at Starbucks in in downtown DC. So they have to VPN in first and then access the login page from within the network. Important to do that because exposing that sort of stuff to the internet is risky. And while you may have password controls over that login page, there still is going to be the potential for things like brute force attacks or even denial of service attacks based on the fact that it's open to the internet. So that stuff usually gets written into a remote access policy. Secure configuration baseline policy, I mentioned this earlier where I spoke to, our organization shall implement a secure configuration baseline according to best practices. So what we're really talking about there is what is the secure configuration baseline? Are we going to center around one of the industry preferred frameworks like the USPCB or perhaps the CIS benchmarks or perhaps even the DISA STIGs if we're in a really secure environment? That stuff should be written into the policy here. And typically what I recommend is a tiered order of precedence for secure configuration baselines. So specifically with any sort of organization that's in a regulated industry, I typically recommend that the organization look at any government-authored secure configuration baselines first as the first preference or in the order of precedence. And if there isn't one for a specific technology, then move down to something like CIS, which is a great resource for secure configuration baselines and has a wealth of information for you out there if you're interested in looking at that. CIS, Center for Internet Security. And if there is no CIS benchmark, then move down to something like a vendor guide or a best practice that's written by a third-party organization. I also try to coach clients to use any sort of automation possible when implementing those because that's really going to enable you to verify compliance in a programmatic way, and any sort of automation you can use is going to make it really, really easy to do the monitoring of and the oversight and compliance component that we talked about earlier. Anytime you can create automated mechanisms for measuring compliance, it's going to help you in the long run. Secure protocol usage. So this is where we talk about not using things like clear text protocols. I still see today in 2016 people using Telnet on networks, and it blows me away because there are well-known secure alternatives to that, thinking SSH or SCP or even SFTP versus FTP. Really needs to be written into policy that we're not going to use insecure protocols like clear text protocols. And not just those clear text protocols, but also deprecated protocols like, for instance, SSL. SSL, even the most recent versions of it have pretty significant flaws to it, and so you need to be on TLS. And even TLS has some issues with it, so even on the most current version of it. So the secure protocol usage policy is important because that's going to help minimize your risk footprint in much the same way that the secure configuration baseline policy is going to. So basically by saying we're going to disallow insecure or deprecated protocols, you're taking a vast majority of the risks off the table for your organization, and being able to verify again programmatically via things like port scans that you are doing it is going to help you when an audit actually comes up. It'll make it very, very easy for you to demonstrate that you're compliant with any regulation out there. And again, that aspect of it, if you implement something like that, you're going to be secure, number one, and then you're going to usually exceed the baseline compliance requirements for most of the regulations that are out there. And at the end of the day, that really should be the goal, right? Protect the information, and compliance will be a net byproduct of that. The vulnerability management policy is also extremely important because, as we know, patches are released every day. There's some new patch that has to be implemented, and being able to keep up with that stuff it's a difficult thing to do. And if it's not written into policy, then what that usually says is that management hasn't really looked at that as a problem that needs to be solved. And if senior leadership isn't seeing that patch management as a significant hurdle to overcome, they're not going to give you the resources that you need in order to actually do that. And so again, that ties back to that governance component of it. And when I hear clients complaining about having a hard time keeping up with patches, I usually think to myself, well, there's probably a lack of attention at that specific problem at the leadership level, or they maybe don't realize how challenging that can really be for a large organization. The one thing I will say, though, is that if secure configuration baselines are implemented and secure protocols are implemented, then the vulnerability management plan and the patch management plan is going to be much easier to keep up with. And the same thing is going to apply to the endpoint security policies when we talk about that next. But it's important for the vulnerability management policy to state things like how frequently you're going to be scanning your organization for vulnerabilities, and not just how frequently you're going to be scanning them, but how quickly you're going to be fixing them. And that's a very important part. Things like FSMA or HIPAA or PCI require a specific amount of time for fixing vulnerabilities after identification. And for instance, like FSMA, typically 72 hours for a critical vulnerability on a high-impact system. So within 72 hours of identification, that organization has to have fixed that problem. And I'm guessing a lot of the audience is probably thinking to themselves, it'd be hard for us to actually implement hot fixes to critical problems in 72 hours. And that's something that's a level of maturity that needs to be worked towards. And again, if it's not driven by governance and implemented in policy, then it's going to be hard to explain or to really demonstrate to leadership that their resources are required to actually keep up with that. Wireless networking policies are probably a little more self-explanatory because wireless networking is so ubiquitous, but things like open Wi-Fi and unsecured Wi-Fi and allowing employees to attach to unsecured Wi-Fi disallowed in policy. That stuff has to be written in there. And if it's written into policy, the other thing is that what will happen is there will be a control implementation procedure wherein the secure configuration baseline of the laptop that you're issuing your employee is configured to not connect to an insecure wireless network. And so it's got to be written into the policy so that the organization knows they've got to actually implement the control at a technical level at some point down the line. So that's network security policies. We'll talk about endpoint security policies now. And there are, again, a lot of overlaps between the network security policies and the endpoint security policies, specifically around vulnerability management, continuous monitoring, and secure configuration baselines. So I won't touch too much on those, but what I will talk about is the change management policy. Change management is an area that is often a little misunderstood. I've seen many organizations put together change control boards that are in spirit really focused on doing the right things, but in practice end up creating a lot of problems because organizations may be trying to implement some new security protocol or security control and are really met with a lot of policy and procedural requirements during change management that not just slow the process down, but contribute to a situation where, again, organizations try to find ways around them. So change management needs to have some teeth to it, but it also needs to be practical. And again, I'm going to touch back on that. Every one of these policies has to be practical and implementable. Otherwise, they're going to do more harm than good. But a change management policy typically would indicate something like your production environment has to go through a change review process that's reviewed for security impacts prior to being moved into production. And that's a perfectly rational thing to do. And really the intent there is once you've achieved a known good state you don't want to introduce new risks into the environment. And the way that you would introduce those new risks is by changing it from that known good state. So those changes need to be managed pretty closely and scrutinized. And that's important to do, but again, keep it practical. Don't inject too much obstacles into the path of your organization is trying to be operationally successful. Security in the way of operations is not a recommended strategy, because again, people will find ways around it. So log management and retention, we'll talk a little bit about that. So every device in your environment produces a log, and those logs are going to be relevant for security monitoring at some point in time. A lot of them are going to be, perhaps noise in your traditional security appliances, but what they all do is contribute to the big picture of what's happening within your environment. And they're really super important if any sort of incident happens to be able to look at the logs and identify the root cause of what actually occurred. Very, very closely linked to the incident response policy that we talked about earlier. Typically, the regulations that our clients work under require something like 1 year of log retention. It's usually something like 30 days or 90 days online and then 1 year offline. Some require much more than that. We've got clients that have 7 years of log retention requirements. And you have to plan for that. And if it's written in the policy, then again, your organization knows that we've got a significant amount of log volume that we need to store. Therefore, we need adequate technical resources to be able to do that. We need the storage architecture to be able to support that. And we need to have the actual log management application to do this, to collect the logs and keep them in one place. And then additionally, just storing the logs isn't necessarily going to get you too much. You'll have met compliance requirements, but you're not really necessarily going to achieve any increased security simply by storing those logs. It's important to analyze those logs on a regular basis as well, and that's going to tie directly to that continuous monitoring policy. If you aren't doing that 24/7 security monitoring of your system logs, then you're probably currently unable to detect security incidents in your network. And being unable to detect a security incident means that you're at significant risk and you simply don't know it. So it's important that log management and retention policy is linked to that continuous monitoring policy. And again, that they're not just in compliance with your regulations, but they're configured to be adequately secure for the type of information that you're trying to protect. Another aspect of that information protection component is that secure disposal. So, I'm talking about things like cryptographically destroying hard drives before you throw them in the trash, or crushing them, or something that is impossible for somebody to pick something out of the trash and put the information back together in a meaningful manner. Important to consider that, and it's also a key requirement for essentially all the regulations out there. Certainly HIPAA, PCI, and FSMA have very specific requirements around secure disposal, ISO as well. So important that you write that into your policy as well. And again, the vulnerability management policy we talked about earlier needs to demonstrate things like how frequently are we scanning and how quickly are we fixing the problems when we identify them. So the last area of policies that we're going to talk about is application security policies. So this is really talking about any applications in the environment that either we develop or that we purchase off the shelf and implement in a production environment to serve some purpose. You're going to see some overlap here with change management, secure protocols, and that vulnerability management. Very similar to what we talked about earlier, particularly the secure protocols component is going to be very important for any sort of web application. Always want to try to use encryption when possible, and if your application requires something like a file transfer, that should be done with SFTP versus FTP. And I'm sure for the security professionals in the audience, that all sounds very basic and very obvious. But for a lot of people that aren't well versed in security, that stuff isn't obvious and it isn't very well known. So it's really got to be written into policy in order for that to be, again, enforceable and implementable at the organization level. Web application security policies they're going to be kind of similar to the other stuff we talked about. In fact, they're kind of overarching with respect to the rest of this stuff. Oops, I skipped ahead here. And the one thing that they're going to talk about there is how do you move from like a development environment to a test environment to a production environment. And so that's going to be, again, very closely linked to the change management component of it. But it should have components of that policy which require things like static code analysis, before being moved into production, or a clean vulnerability scan before being moved into production. Things like that are going to be really important for your secure systems development lifecycle in the long run, but really need to be, again, written into the policy in order for that to be implemented at the organization level. So we wanted to give some examples of some policies, and to start off with, we're going to just talk about what are the actual components of a policy, what should typically be in the policy from the different categories of information that should be within the policy, and then we're going to give you some specific requirements of a good policy that we'll talk about in a few minutes here. So first, what should be in a policy? So first and foremost, this is what we're going to talk about as a password policy. There should be a statement about why the policy is required, and that could be simply something like, passwords are an extremely important part of our security program and need to be protected and need to be configured in a manner that is secure, and it could really be as simple and generic as that. The specific stuff is going to come a little later. Purpose, what the policy is meant to achieve. We're trying to secure our assets, and we're trying to ensure that people use difficult to guess passwords or difficult to crack passwords. The scope of what the policy will cover, in this case, that would be all employees. It also typically would also include something like all third-party organizations that have an account on our systems. May even include any users of web-facing applications. So if you're an organization that has a web application that serves the public, your password policy should also include how it impacts those users. So the passwords that your users are using in your web application are as secure as those that you use internally. And then, of course, the specific requirements of the policy in that policy section. And then the policy compliance, how will you actually measure compliance with that policy? Are there any exceptions? In some cases, there may be appropriate exceptions in password policy, probably not too many, but there are some times where exceptions can be written into policies, have to be really carefully managed though. We typically call those deviations, and whenever you see a deviation, it should usually be a temporary exception, where it's something that's reviewed every 6 months or 1 year to determine whether or not it's still required. And there really should be a direct line from that deviation to some significant business justification to waive the policy. And if that doesn't exist, then you're simply just it's a deviation for convenience's sake, and that's not a very good reason to deviate from policy. Then you want to have references to other standards, policies, and processes. If there's anything that's either dependent upon this or that this is dependent upon, then that should be referenced there. And definitions and terms, obviously, that's if there's any jargon or specific language that you're asking a non-technical individual to understand, you want to make sure you define it. And if the policy has changed over time, you want to make sure you keep a track of revisions. So at a high level, that's what you typically would see in a policy. What are some specific requirements of a good password policy? So a good password should be at least 12 characters, should be alphanumeric, should contain uppercase and lowercase characters and some special characters. That's important because so often, if you follow any of the hacking websites that talk about who got owned or whose information was pasted out on the internet, usually includes a big password dump, and the passwords that I see so often are things literally like password 123 or simply 1234567. And the fact that that's even possible to use in an organization is unbelievable to me. So what that demonstrates is that password policies are usually very inadequate and they're not stringent enough in respect of what they're requiring. Or if the policy itself is actually requiring the right things, then the process which is used to implement it isn't working or isn't being followed. And we're actually, the next webinar that we talk about in this program of 5 is going to be talking about process and how we can make sure that policy is implemented correctly via process. It's really important to do. Another component of a good password policy is that people should not be using the same passwords on their corporate accounts for any personal accounts. Now that one, if you think about it, that's probably a little bit more difficult to measure compliance with because you really can't know what passwords an employee is using on their own personal accounts, but it still needs to be written into policy. And here's why. If a user in your organization has their account compromised on Facebook, for instance, and it just happens to be known that that individual is an employee of your organization, and that same password was used and was used to compromise you, it's directly linkable back to the non-compliance of this policy, and that's something which again should have some consequences for that individual. Password should be changed no less frequently than every 90 days, and the way that should be configured in your systems is to actually require a lockout every 90 days if the password hasn't actually changed, or simply prompt the user that your password's expired and you've got to change it. It has to be written in the policy in order for there to be a technical implementation of that control at the device level. This next one's important. So privileged accounts, things like systems administrators. There is a higher level of trust that is given to a privileged account. Therefore, there should be a higher level of scrutiny over the passwords of those accounts. So we typically recommend stronger passwords for privileged accounts. And while I hope to many of you this sounds like common sense, I often see this not implemented correctly. But make sure that within your own organization you're requiring that privileged accounts, things like administrators or root accounts on Unix servers or enable accounts on Cisco devices, are very strong. They require significantly long passwords with many characters, must contain alphanumeric, lowercase, and uppercase, and special characters. And my preference is that any sort of administrative or privileged account use two-factor authentication. So password plus something else, whether that be a biometric or a secure token or something along those lines, should be required. Privileged accounts also should be changed more frequently. And while this is going to create some administrative burden within your organization, the trade-off of the reduction in risk is worth it. So make sure that your privileged accounts are both very strong and also changed frequently. And the last one, again, I hope is common sense to the audience, but if it's not, please don't share your passwords, and please ensure that your users aren't sharing their passwords either. And that's something which you can both write into policy and then drill into their heads during the security awareness training. Passwords are like toothbrushes. You don't share them. So how can an MSSP actually help with policy? So first off, there are a couple of things that we talked about earlier that I think it's worth to drill back into. Policies can be really complex. Do you remember that kind of flow diagram we showed you of how policies, guidelines, standards, and procedures are all interlinked? That can actually be kind of a complex ecosystem of documentation, and mapping that from a regulation from just some words on paper to technical control implementation can take some technical acumen. It can take some knowledge of how that process works, and it's not always a real simple thing. And a lot of times when a process or a policy is developed in a vacuum with just looking at I'm going to be secure, I'm going to have the iron fist approach, you're going to have employees that find ways to work around those policies, because I would consider that to be a poor policy. A good policy needs to be practical. It needs to take into account the regulatory organization, the framework the organization falls under, the business practices of the organization, the risk tolerance of the organization, which is going to be set again at the governance level that we talked about last time, and all that stuff needs to be baked into what that policy looks like at a high level. And then from there, how do we actually take that again those words and put it into a technical control implementation? And that's where a good MSSP can really help, because we certainly know the difference between a practical and an impractical policy. We've seen thousands of both examples of practical and impractical, and have helped organizations move from totally impractical, unwieldy policy all the way to high-functioning, advanced, and mature organizations. And additionally, a good MSSP is going to act as your trusted partner, and not all of them will. A lot of them are simply just going to be a service provider that you're going to get an invoice from. But a good MSSP, acting as your trusted partner, can take all that stuff that I mentioned into account and put together a program that is all-encompassing, that includes the governance stuff that we talked about last time, that includes all of the policy considerations that we just talked about today, in addition to what works within your environment and how your organization operates at a high level, and bake that into a program which is going to work for you. And that's certainly something that a good MSSP can do for you, and certainly something that TruShield could do for you. So with that said, do we have any questions from the audience today? Okay, is this going to be sent out? Yes, the presentation will be emailed out to attendees. And let's see, the next one I've got is, what are the best ways you found to enforce security policies? Okay, so enforcing security policies, so there needs to be a continuum of enforcement mechanisms. And that continuum should start with something like a reprimand or a warning and move all the way down to termination. And that, unfortunately, does need to be written into the policy that if employees are not compliant with it, then they do face the ultimate consequence of termination. But that shouldn't be the first resort, unless it's such a significant policy violation that's caused hardship for the organization, and you should have that capability. But that shouldn't be the first step unless it's been a serious incident. Other things include, so start with a reprimand, move to additional training, move to perhaps some limited access to the internet, which is a pretty effective punishment, and then move on to things like a written warning within that employee's file, their employee file, and then all the way up to termination. Again, important that you have that termination aspect available, but it shouldn't again be the first resort. Okay, another question here. Data classification policy, what do I think about that? So data classification policy is extremely important, and that's a very good question, because the types of data that you're processing are really going to be highly influential over what sort of security controls you're going to put in place over the top of them. And so it's important that you do classify the data that you're processing between the different buckets of safe for public use, or internal only, or sensitive but unclassified, or even all the way up to classified. And that the controls that you write around them, the policies that you write around how you protect them, are going to be dependent upon what's the importance of the sensitivity of the information we're trying to protect. And very, very important that that's addressed properly. The one thing I'll say there is that you do need to take into account that there certainly is information that could be publicly available, and it's not going to damage you at all, and therefore that information, it should have a different level of protection over it than something which is highly sensitive. And I'm sure that sounds, again, pretty self-explanatory to the audience here today, but there are a lot of times I see organizations apply very rigorous security controls over a database that has nothing but public information in it. And that creates wasted expenditure on their parts, and also a lot of administrative burden on implementing really high security controls when they aren't really necessary. So the good rule of thumb there is no security countermeasure should cost more than it would cost to suffer a loss of that data in the first place. So if your organization could stand to lose $100,000 for one specific security incident, you should not spend more than $100,000 on preventing that incident. Otherwise, you've wasted money. And that does tie back to that data classification aspect of it as well, so that you know what sort of information you're processing in the environment, and how you're going about protecting it. That's a good question. Any other questions? Doesn't look like I do. So I guess with that said, again, thank you guys for attending the webinar today. If you do have additional questions or comments or concerns, or just simply want to talk about how TruShield could help you define your information security policies, we'd be happy to take that up at that time. Oh, it looks like we did get one last second question coming here. Okay, nope, actually that's it. Okay, so again, folks, appreciate the time today, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Please attend our next webinar where we talk about how do we actually implement these policies we talked about today. Thank you.